Pardon?
Back up. I forgot to push the video button.
Oh,
Start over.
Poor boy.
chapter 10, verse 14. How then can the Jews call on the one that they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. But not all the Israelites accepted the good news. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word of Christ. But I ask, did they not hear? Of course they did. Their voice has gone out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. Again I ask, did Israel not understand? First, Moses says, I will make you envious by those who are not a nation. I will make you angry by a nation that has no understanding. And Isaiah boldly says, I was found by those who did not seek me. I revealed myself to those who did not ask for me. But concerning Israel, he says, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people.
Is he talking about us?
Okay, folks, here we go. This is actually considered to be the most obscure and difficult passage in all of Romans,
Oh, I don't believe that.
which is often difficult enough without getting worse. So, let's try to wade through these verses very carefully. Here's the basic scheme of things. Paul has been saying all along that the way to God is not through works, is not through the law, but is by
Grace of God.
faith and trust, and by the grace of God. A problem arises, however, and somebody might say, well, what if the Jews never heard of all this? How are they to be held accountable if they've never heard? Paul says, no excuse. That's no excuse at all. And Paul deals with this with four separate objections by using scriptural texts. Here's the first objection. You cannot be expected to call on God unless you believe God exists. You cannot believe there is a God if you've never heard about Him. You cannot hear about God unless someone tells you about Him. And there can be no one to tell about God unless God has commissioned somebody to do it. So, the Jews shouldn't be condemned for all this. Paul says, Isaiah 52:7, how welcome is the one who brings you good news about something good, which is to say, you cannot say that there was no messenger. Isaiah was a messenger. And he brought the message, the good news, centuries before. And like many of the other prophets, it was ignored. Paul says, you can choose to ignore it, but you don't have an excuse because the message was given. Objection number 2. Even if this argument is true in point of fact, Israel did not obey the good news. Paul says Israel's disbelief was to be expected. What? Israel's disbelief was to be expected. Isaiah said, centuries before, in utter despair over the chosen people, Lord, who has believed what we have heard? We've given them the message, they won't listen. In other words, in their refusal, Israel was running true to form. History was repeating itself again. The Jews had done this over and over and over. In fact, when they didn't want to hear what the prophets had to say, sometimes they killed the prophets to shut them up. They've had opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to hear, but they refuse to listen. Objection 3. It's a restatement insisting that the people never really had the chance to hear the good news. Paul turns to Psalm 10:4. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words, hi Shay, and their words to the end of the world. In other words, Paul says, don't tell me that Israel never got the chance to hear, because God's message is clear that it had gone out throughout the entire world. But then there's another objection. But what if Israel heard the message, but just didn't understand it? You can't blame people for that, can you? Just not understanding it? What if the message was so difficult to grasp that the people were just unable to comprehend the significance of the message? Paul says, Israel may well have failed to understand, but that's their fault.
I'm not sure that Paul was any better about explaining it.
Well, he had come to understand, but only after a powerful conversion experience. But Paul says, the Gentiles didn't have that problem. The Gentiles got the message right from the get-go, even though the message came unexpectedly and unsolicited.
Well, that's because the Gentiles weren't consumed in the Mosaic Law,
That's correct.
and the Jews were consumed in that law, and they couldn't hear it.
That's right. And that's why he says the law was a stumbling block.
Yeah.
The very thing that the Jews felt they had to do to get righteous was the very thing that was their downfall.
Right.
The Gentiles didn't have that stumbling block. They were open to it, and they jumped at the opportunity. To prove this point, Paul quotes two passages, and one is from Deuteronomy 32:21, where God says,
Terry's not here.
huh?
I'm sorry,
Well,
Terry. Yeah,
No,
Terry's not here.
that's not the one he likes so much. He likes
It's Deuteronomy and Leviticus.
Leviticus, I think it
Yeah.
is. God says, because of Israel's disobedience and rebellion, God will transfer his favor to another people, and they will be forced to become jealous of a nation which has no nation. Holy cow, this is back in Deuteronomy. And the second passage is from Isaiah 65, where God says that in a strange way, he has been found by a people who were not looking for him at all. Incredible. That's incredible. I mean, we think that Jesus, when he was alive, was the very first one to allude to the Gentiles as possible people. My gosh, it's been going on for centuries in the scriptures. It's fascinating to me. Maybe it isn't to you, but it is to me. Now, following this argument, Paul then goes on to insist that all through history, God has been reaching out to Israel, appealing to Israel over and over and over. Israel has always been disobedient. They have always been perverse, if you will. The issue becomes this. Is this intentional and premeditated on Israel's part? Or is it inexcusable ignorance? Or is it excusable ignorance? What does Paul say? He says it's inexcusable ignorance for three reasons. And remember, Paul doesn't do this out of anger. Remember that? Paul has an incredible compassion for his people. He weeps over the tragedy of his people. He says, first of all, it's ignorance which comes from the neglect of knowledge. You know, there's a saying, genuine ignorance may be a defense, but neglect of knowledge never is. Okay? You cannot be blamed for not knowing what you never had a chance to know. But you can be blamed for neglecting to know something that has always been available to you. Paul says the Jews have no excuse. Second of all, he says ignorance comes from willful blindness. People have an incredible capacity for shutting their minds to what they do not want to know. People often simply refuse to look at the facts or the truth and turn a blind eye. The results can be disastrous. And we see it all the time in every religion in the world. You know, how Jehovah's Witnesses can believe that the world was created 6,280 years ago. I mean, that's willful blindness. How can you possibly blind yourself to the realities of it all? But they do. They do. People are capable of blocking anything, and therefore believing anything, no matter how incredible it may seem. And then third, Paul
And then
says,
some people believe everything.
correct. Are you one of them, Sandy?
No,
No, okay.
but some
Yeah.
people, no matter, okay, I'll grab that,
Yeah, right.
that star and go with that one. Oh, well, maybe I'll grab this one and go
Yeah,
with that
and
one.
those are usually the kind of people that, when they jump from one thing to the next, they leave behind the one thing they did believe, and now they're believing
Right,
something new, and then they
right.
discard that, and they go on to something else.
You
Every
never know
week
where-
is another
you
fad,
never
another
know
belief.
where they are.
Never know where they're coming
Yeah.
from.
And that theory is rampant in politics.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes.
Let's not even go there.
That's okay.
And then Paul says, there is also ignorance, which is, in essence, a lie. God gives us a conscience. He gives us the guidance of the Holy Spirit. But how many times do we plead ignorance when in all honesty, in our hearts, we know darn good and well what the truth is? But we say, well, I just didn't really know things were going to turn out like this. When actually, we knew what was going to happen. We knew, we were just trying to fool ourselves. Well, that's ignorance, which is essentially a lie. So Paul is trying to drive home the fact that the Jews had a personal responsibility. They ought to have known better. They had every chance to know better. They should have known better. But they rejected God's appeal anyhow. On the one hand, we can say that God is behind everything, and yet at the same time, we all have free will. And we can accept or reject what God offers. It's kind of a paradox, isn't it? God is in control, but God really isn't in control. How else are you going to put it? Humans have free will. And Paul says, well, yeah, God is in control, but still the Jews were able to say yes or no, nay or yea. Okay. We begin with chapter 11. I ask then, did God reject his people? By no means. I'm an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham and from the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people, whom he foreknew. Don't you know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah, how he appealed to God against Israel? He said, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I'm the only one left, and they're trying to kill me. And what was God's answer to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. And if by grace, then it is no longer by works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. What then? What Israel sought so earnestly, it did not obtain, but the elect did. The others were hardened, as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes so that they could not see, and ears so they could not hear to this very day. And David says, may their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. May their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and their backs be bent forever. Again I ask, Did they stumble, the Jews? Did the Jews stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? No, not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. But if their transgression means riches for the world, and their loss means riches for the Gentiles, how much greater riches will their fullness bring? Now Paul says, now I'm turning to you Gentiles, so you guys listen up, being as how we're all Gentiles here. Inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I make much of my ministry in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. For if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? And he says, if the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, did you know that? You were all wild olive shoots? You as a wild olive shoot have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root. Do not boast over those branches. If you do, consider this. You do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. Don't be arrogant. Don't be afraid. For if God did not spare the natural branches, He may not spare you either. Consider therefore the kindness and sternness of God. Sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in His kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. After all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into the olive tree? You following all that?
Yeah.
Sort of. Okay, that's good. Sort of is better than not at all. What Paul's doing here, obviously, he's turning and speaking to the Gentiles, but he tells them, as much as I am an apostle to you as Gentiles, I can't forget my own people, the Jews. In fact, his hopes are that Christianity, what Christianity has done for the Gentiles, will make the Jews envy enough so that they might come back and accept Christ themselves.
It seems a stretch to call the culture tree the culture, because they're not getting it.
Let's call it a garden tree. The olive tree that's been made a garden productive olive tree, as opposed to a wild olive tree that doesn't even produce good olives. Okay? If that were to happen, Paul would be elated. If the tragedy of the Jews' rejection ends up with the Gentiles bringing the Jews in, Paul says, wow, that'd be cool. That would be like the Jews coming back from the dead and living again. He says that's my hope. To explain that the Jews can never be finally rejected, Paul gives two explanatory pictures. First of all, he uses food. A Jewish custom, before any food is eaten, the first part had to be offered to God in blessing. So, for example, if dough was being prepared for the first part of that dough was offered to God, that offering made all of the dough sacred. Okay? The offering of the first part sanctified the whole. Since the Jewish patriarchs were chosen and consecrated by God, and since the whole nation sprang from them, Paul says the consecration of the nation's founders made the whole nation sacred in a very special way to God, by the same idea, same concept. But then Paul goes into this great allegory about the olive tree. It would have been a good allegory for the Jews because the prophets often described Israel as God's olive tree, okay, which was supposed to bear really good fruit. So Paul is thinking here of the Gentiles as branches of a wild olive that have been grafted into the garden olive of Israel. The Gentiles, they've been out in the desert, living wild amongst the briars, just crazy people.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
Resemble that.
But by an act of God's grace, they are now grafted into the richness and fertility of the tended garden olive tree. From all of this, Paul gives
Does that
both
mean
a
you have to
word.
clean up your act?
Well, we would hope to some extent, yes.
Oh,
Just a little.
From all of this, Paul gives both a word of warning and also a word of hope. He gives this warning. It'd be really easy for the Gentiles to develop an attitude of contempt for the Jews. Especially in a world, at that time especially, where Jews were universally hated to begin with by everybody. They're still hated in the world today by a lot of people too. And it's easy for the Gentiles to cop an attitude about it. And one of the saddest chapters in all of the history of Christianity was the way the Jews were victimized and characterized by the church. One of the worst things the Christian church has ever done. But here's the thing. There would never be such a thing as Christianity if it had not been for the Jews first. Christianity owes a huge debt to Judaism. So as a grafted on branch can be lopped off even more easily than a naturally grown branch. So don't get too hoitsy-toitsy here. And the hope is that the Gentiles have experienced God's kindness. The Jews have experienced God's severity. If faithful, the Gentiles will remain in that kindness. But if the Jews enter into belief, they too can be grafted back in and enjoy God's kindness. From all this, I suppose we ought to learn a lesson ourselves. It's a big mistake for a Christian to disregard the Old Testament, thinking that it's just a Jewish book that has no relevance to Christianity. Holy cow, that's just not true at all. And there are Christian groups that believe that. Judaism is the root of the olive tree, from which Christianity is grafted on and enabled to grow. Only a foolish man kicks away the ladder which raised him to the height he has reached. And like I say, one of the horrible things of church history is the way the Jews were characterized. A large amount of the discrimination against, prejudice against Jews through even the time of the Holocaust. The church has to accept some responsibility for that. Characterizing the Jews as Christ killers, which is completely wrong. First of all, it was not the Jewish nation that crucified Christ. It was a small group of Jewish politicians that participated in the crucifixion of Christ. Second of all, it wasn't the Jews that actually killed him because it was illegal for them to carry out a capital punishment. It was the Romans that crucified him. And for any Gentile today who still thinks the Jews should all be blamed for killing Christ, let me tell you something. Each and every one of us, each time we sin, contributes to the crucifixion of Christ. So don't go out there and start shooting off your mouth against the Jews. We should respect our Jewish brothers. We should be grateful. And we should be like Paul and pray and hope that we can get them back. That we can somehow make them see what their mistake was, what their stumbling block is. And of course, over the centuries, there have been hundreds of thousands, millions of Jews that have come back in, and there still are Jewish people who are coming back in, but it's something as Gentiles we better not get too snobbish about, that's for sure. Okay, we'll
Thank you,
continue on
Brian.
next week.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.